There are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We are all crew. Marshall McLuhan, right? That quote feels, well, it's particularly relevant today. It's such a powerful reminder that, when we talk about humanity, our numbers, our choices. It's not just statistic, it's our shared journey. Okay, so let's unpack this. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something really fundamental, the huge shifts happening in global population dynamics. And we're zooming in on two giants, China and India. Our guide for this is a, frankly, exceptional analysis recently put out by the Observer Research Foundation, ORF. So our mission today, let's try to cut through the noise, pinpoint the key turning points, and really pull out the vital lessons from their experiences. This isn't just history class. It's about understanding the choices nations make about population and the often unexpected results for millions of people, for economies, for the future. And it's especially crucial if you're tracking current affairs, economic trends, or, preparing for big exams like the UPSC. These insights give you a vital handle on global and national challenges.
Absolutely. And what's so interesting here is it's not just looking back. The ORF piece is really forward-looking. It raises some absolutely critical questions about policy, about where demographics are headed, and ultimately societal well-being. And like you said, it offers some really indispensable takeaways, specifically for India, which makes it super relevant for understanding where the country's going.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Picture the 1950s. The world's finding its feet after huge conflicts, lots of optimism, but massive challenges too. And right then, both China and India see this incredibly rapid surge in their populations, just boom. And what's striking is how quickly both governments reacted. It wasn't seen as a good thing, not really. Almost immediately, it was framed as a, quote, threat to national economic development and social well-being. Like this huge hurdle they needed to overcome urgently.
Exactly. And the scale, just to give you a sense, think about this. 1951, China's population, already 553.75 million. That's massive. India, meanwhile, was at 361.08 million. Also enormous numbers, even back then. So the ORF analysis points out that efforts to manage this started surprisingly early in both places. The aim was literally to re-engineer demographics, to get a handle on what they saw as this unbridled population explosion. And this shared feeling, this early alarm, it really set the stage for the very, very different paths the two countries ended up taking. Almost opposite paths, in fact.
Right, and here's where it gets really interesting, kind of paradoxical, actually, when you look at China's story first. Because despite those alarms you mentioned, back in the 50s, the Chinese leadership, initially anyway, didn't see population as a problem. They saw it as a strength, famously declared that people are the most precious resource. What a contrast to what came later, huh?
It really is.
And their early health initiatives were, well, pretty impressive. In 1953, they rolled out comprehensive maternal and child health care. And it worked. Mortality rates dropped significantly. Sounds like a success, right, at first?
Oh, it was an immediate dramatic success in those terms.
Serious.
But the consequence. By 1970, just under 2 decades later, China had added another 250 million people. Astonishing. Now, that's great for health, but it quickly spooked the government. The sheer numbers started putting this huge, unsustainable strain on everything. Public services, education, healthcare, you name it.
So the policy started to shift.
It did. In the 1970s, they brought in policies mandating specific population growth targets. That did start to slow things down a bit. They even had this campaign, later, longer, fewer, encouraging people to marry later, wait longer between kids, have fewer kids overall. But even that, it didn't quite hit the targets they wanted. And by 1982, China's population crossed the 1 billion mark. A huge number, psychologically and logistically.
And that led to?
That led to the big one. In 1982, the one-child policy was implemented. And the ORF piece notes it was done with great rigor. Basically, couples were directed to have only one child. There were incentives if you complied.
But also penalties if you didn't.
Severe penalties. Financial levies, forced abortions, sterilizations, intense social pressure. It was a massive state intervention into the most private family decisions. Unprecedented, really.
Wow, and the consequences. The ORF analysis talks about unanticipated consequences leading to serious imbalances. That sounds ominous.
It was. The impact was profound. Take the total fertility rate, the average number of kids a woman has. In 1970, it was 6.1 in China. By 2020, just 1.28.
1.28. That's way below replacement level, isn't it? Like the 2.1 needed just to keep the population stable.
Exactly. Way below. And that wasn't all. There was this deep-seated cultural preference for boys. Combine that with the one-child limit, and you got a massive gender imbalance. More girls were aborted, sometimes abandoned.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. And then you had the age structure shift dramatically.
Right.
A sharply rising ratio of older people compared to younger people.
Which means fewer workers,
Right.
a smaller consumer base, Bad for the economy long term?
Precisely, a declining workforce, a shrunken consumer market, long-term drag on the Chinese economy. Plus, the cost of looking after all those elderly people, geriatric care, started to skyrocket. Fewer young people to support them.
A demographic earthquake, as you said, systemic aftershocks.
You got it. And eventually, the government couldn't ignore these severe issues. They were alarmed. So from 2013, they started slowly rolling back the one-child policy. By 2017, it was completely gone.
And they even went further recently, right? A three-child policy.
Yes, after 2022. A three-child policy, complete with lots of incentives, trying desperately to get people to have more kids.
But it hasn't really worked, has it? That seems like a crucial lesson. Why not?
Well, a huge factor is just the cost. Soaring housing prices, the general cost of living. It's just economically tough for many Chinese families to even think about having larger families now.
Makes sense.
And then COVID-19, plus China's really strict zero-COVID approach, that just made things even harder.
So once those gears shift, they're incredibly hard to turn back.
Incredibly hard. And the projections for China's future, they're pretty stark. It really highlights how tough it is to reverse these trends. By 2050, estimates suggest they might have 100 million fewer people, total around 1.3 billion.
Then by the end of the century.
Could be a much steeper decline, maybe down to 771 million, which, to put it in perspective, is roughly half of what India's population is projected to be in 2100. A massive contraction.
Wow. So that really brings us to the crucial question, doesn't it? Especially for us here, thinking about policy, or for you listening, maybe prepping for UPSC, what does China's dramatic story mean for India? While China was dealing with all this fallout, India was on its own population path, a path that, as ORF shows, turned out quite differently.
Very differently.
So let's recap India. 1951, population 361.08 million, also growing fast. And just like China initially, this growth was seen as a serious obstacle to economic growth.
Yep. And India also acted early, right after independence. 1952, they introduced the National Family Planning Program, one of the first countries in the world to do so, actually. They expanded reproductive health services, redoubled efforts in the 60s. The target was ambitious. Get the birth rate down to 3.9% by 1974.
But it didn't quite work out as planned. Despite the efforts, the population kept rising.
It did. By 1971, India's population hit 547.94 million. So those early policies, however well-meaning, didn't stem the tide as much as they'd hoped.
Which led to that difficult period in the mid-70s.
Exactly. A critical, though thankfully brief, turning point. During the emergency, the government experimented with highly coercive family planning, specifically forced sterilization.
It sounds awful, and the reaction?
Of immense political and public backlash, a huge misstep. And because of that reaction, the policy was, as the ORF piece says, quickly abandoned. But its shadow, its legacy, really affected public trust in family planning programs for years.
That's a really pivotal moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
India's quick rejection of coercion versus China's long-term policy. A stark contrast.
A huge contrast.
So after that backlash in the 70s, India shifted gears completely.
Totally. A new family welfare department was created. Then came the more comprehensive national population policy in 2000. The focus shifted. It became about meeting unmet needs for contraception, aiming for a stable population by 2045, but really emphasizing voluntary choice, not compulsion.
And how did the impact compare to China's, according to ORF?
Well, the source highlights a key difference. It says, although substantial, the overall impact of India's population policies was not as extreme as in China's case.
Yep.
India's fertility rate also dropped significantly, from 5.73 births per woman down to 1.96 in 2024. So like China, that's now below replacement level.
Okay.
But crucially, India's experiment with coercion was very short-lived. That difference meant its sex ratio did not get skewed nearly as badly as China's. And very importantly, a large proportion of India's population continued to be young. It preserved what we call the demographic dividend.
Ah, the demographic dividend. That period where you have a large working-age population relative to dependents, fueling economic growth.
Exactly that. A critical asset for India that China, arguably, started losing much earlier due to its policies.
That's a powerful distinction. Okay, so looking ahead for India, what are the projections?
Also fascinating. India's population is actually estimated to keep growing, but only until about 2063. It's expected to peak at around 1.67 billion.
And after 2063?
Then, like China, India's demography is projected to enter a phase of decline. But here's the crucial point, especially for long-term planning. Long before that, the ORF report stresses, India's elderly population will rise sharply, which means down the line, a smaller workforce and a much larger population needing geriatric care.
So similar challenges to China eventually, just on a different timeline. This really changes society, doesn't it? It needs serious foresight.
Absolutely. It reshapes everything.
So this brings us to the big picture question. What are the overarching lessons here from these two massive but very different national experiments in population control? What does ORF identify as the key takeaways for everyone?
Yeah, the source pulls out some really core insights. First, it strongly suggests that aggressive state attempts to control reproductive choices, reproductive reengineering, well, they may not yield targeted results. In fact, they may turn counterproductive. China's overcorrection and India's quick rejection of force both kind of illustrate that, right?
Makes sense, that is.
Second, and this is just as important, trying to reverse these policies once demographic trends are moving, it may prove ineffective. Why? Because ground realities would have significantly changed. China's struggle right now to boost births, even with incentives, that's a perfect real-world example of this demographic inertia. Once people get used to smaller families, maybe due to costs or social changes, it's incredibly hard to shift that back.
Right. Habits and expectations change.
Exactly. And the analysis also makes a really insightful connection between economic development and demographics. It points out that economic development supplements women's empowerment. It offers them greater bodily agency, basically, more control over their own bodies and reproductive health, free from coercion. And this makes them less prone to shouldering the responsibility of raising larger families, a burden often unfairly pushed onto women.
Okay, so development itself changes family size decisions.
Right. And the source also notes how ineffective calls for supporting national interest by raising larger families usually are. It cites developed Western countries, Japan, even China now, as places where patriotic appeals for more babies just haven't worked. Economic realities and individual empowerment seem much more powerful.
That lands us squarely back in India's court then. Given everything we've discussed, what does this mean for India right now? Especially for those of you listening who are thinking about policy or maybe studying for exams where these long-term trends are vital. What's the specific imperative for India, according to ORF?
Okay, for India, the key takeaway from the source is pretty blunt. India has already reached fertility rates below replacement level, that 1.96 number. So reversing the demographic trend toward population decline will be an uphill task. The report actually states, no country in human history has succeeded in doing that once fertility falls below replacement and stays there.
Wow. No country. That's sobering.
It is. So given that reality, the source lays out some very specific and you could say quite bold policy recommendations for India. First, it says the government must immediately shut down its population control departments across the country. The implication being they're just not needed anymore, maybe even counterproductive.
Interesting. Yeah.
Second, it emphasizes that the institution of family and marriage needs to be extolled, more of a societal, cultural reinforcement perhaps.
And third,
and this is a big one, efforts at raising fertility and providing substantive assistance to families with 3 children must become top governmental investment.
Investment, not control. And why 3 children specifically?
The rationale given is crucial. It's so that the child develops an asset rather than a cost burden for the family and for society. It's about shifting the entire perspective from population control to population enablement and support.
A fundamental shift. And it leaves us with that final powerful line from the ORF analysis, doesn't it? A warning for everyone.
Yes. Nations can afford to disregard demography only at their peril. A stark reminder, really, of how deeply these population trends shape our world.
What a journey.
Yeah.
Seriously. Through China's path, India's path, early alarms, drastic policies, unexpected outcomes, the struggle to change course, the lessons for governance, for society, for the economy, they're just massive. It's a compelling story about policy, human lives, and, well, how complex systems work, or sometimes don't work as planned.
It really is. And if you connect it to the bigger picture, it definitely makes you think, right? Given how complex these shifts are, what else beyond just government policy might India need to consider to really make the most of its demographic future, especially knowing that aging population is coming sooner than maybe we thought? Things like community support, cultural attitudes, economic opportunities, individual choice. They all seem more vital than ever in navigating what's ahead. It's uncharted territory in many ways.
Indeed. Well, we really hope this deep dive has given you a shortcut to getting informed on this critical topic, whether you're prepping for an exam like the UPSC, heading into a discussion, or maybe just satisfying your curiosity about how nations tick. If you found this discussion valuable, maybe for your UPSC prep, your general knowledge, or just sparking some new ideas, please do give this deep dive a like, subscribe to our channel for more insights like this, and definitely leave a comment below, ask questions, tell us what surprised you. Your engagement really helps us figure out what deep dives to do next. Thanks so much for joining us on the deep dive. We'll catch you next time.